my first question to you is that you have done a lot of research on the sedition laws. How does it affect the journalists of India?
Uh, well, sedition is, as you know, a colonial law, and it's a legacy from the British past. It has been used against freedom fighters in India. It has been used throughout independence. It has been used to curb freedom of expression. This continued even after independence, and despite several attempts to remove it, discussions, debates, sedition continues to be on the statute books. Now, over the last 10 years at least, we have been seeing sedition being used very systematically against journalists and against writers, against people who, even cartoonists, people who speak out and who are voices of dissent. Often, sedition is used for the most flimsiest and absurd of reasons. There is a student who was charged with sedition just because he didn't stand up for the national anthem in a movie theater. There was a student, there was someone else who shared a video or liked a cartoon on Facebook. A journalist from Chhattisgarh who has now challenged the Sedition Act sections in the Indian Penal Code was also charged just because he liked a Facebook post. So this can be, and these are people who are already known to be voices of dissent in some way or the other. So there's a very clear way in which the law is misused to harass them and also to stigmatize them, which is the more insidious way in which sedition operates, because it is seen as a law that is against the national interest. It is seen as it is framed as a law that works, to show that some people spread disaffection. That's how the law is framed, but that isn't actually not the case very often. Despite the fact that sedition has been read down by the Supreme Court, it continues to be made use of. There are very few convictions. Despite that, police are empowered to be able to arrest people, put them behind bars, and the process to secure justice is very painful, it's very long, and very isolating.
Some people are of the opinion that they defend that the sedition is used to control the anti-national elements of this country, especially the Maoists who continue to run the parallel government in some districts of our country. How will we know whether something is sedition or not?
Whatever we have in terms of cases of sedition that have already been lodged against people in areas where there is a lot of conflict, internal conflict, as in the areas of Maoist insurgency, or in places like Kashmir or in the Northeast, where there is some kind of internal conflict. It becomes very important to be able to establish whether the acts are seditious or not. We have cases of journalists, since you asked about journalists earlier, who have actually gone to cover incidents of violence and have gone to write about the security forces and how they have harassed and penalized villagers, even in terms of massacres by security forces. But these are seen as acts of sedition. So it's a very dangerous weapon, really, where the state has the weapons otherwise also to be able to curb what they call insurgency activities. What they actually use are these weapons for either innocent villagers, innocent Adivasis, or journalists who are trying to write about them. So more often than not, sedition is a weapon that's used to criminalize any kind of information that is coming out, which presents some kind of reality of these situations. The government also uses very draconian provisions like UAPA. In Chhattisgarh, there is the Public Security Act. So there are other laws. Now we have the Law Commission, which is saying that sedition should be enhanced, that it should be increased and not repealed, but punishment should be increased. This is not going to solve any problem. It's not going to, insurgency is not going to go away by increasing the punishment. What is actually going to happen are innocent people who are going to suffer. At this point, we have 6 journalists who are in custody, 6, including Gautam Naulaka, who is under house arrest, and he is well known as a writer and journalist. We've had 2 journalists who were released from custody this year. Journalist from Kashmir called Manandar and Siddiq Kapan, who was in jail just because he went to cover a gang rape and murder of this young woman in Hathras in Uttar Pradesh. He didn't even get there. He didn't even write his story, but he was picked up. So for journalists in custody, some journalists have completed just 1 year last week. Rupesh Kumar has completed an entire year in custody. Fahad Shah has been in jail for the last, I think, 500 days. It's time doesn't seem to have any meaning really in the way in which they're just put behind bars and made to literally languish and go from one case to another. So it's actually a very grim situation for journalists. And the worst thing really is, apart from the journalists who have been arrested and are behind bars, there are a number of journalists who have cases lodged against them. And number of journalists who are constantly fearful that they could be picked up for some reason or the other. So there is this atmosphere of apprehension, despite the fact that journalists are still writing a lot. There's always this atmosphere of a threat of punitive action against them.
As our Freedom Press ranking said that we ranked as 142nd, but many people disapprove this report that they are interfering in India's internal matters.
These are global rankings, and the ranking that you are referring to is from the RSF, and there are other international press freedom organizations who have their own rankings. Committee to Protect Journalists has its own index. So there are different indices and they have different parameters. Okay, so they are doing this. It's not really about interfering with one country's sovereignty or anything, because these are global rankings across all countries of the world. So it's not really a question about targeting India specifically. The thing is, the Indian government can come out with its own data. And in 2014, actually, the government said that they would come out with their own data on attacks on journalists. And I think for about a year or two, the NCRB, which is the National Crime Records Bureau, had its own data. They came out with something and then they stopped. And then they said they didn't have the format or they were working out the methodology. So where is their data? If you're so worried about the global data, give your own data. Let's see it. Let's take a look at your data. That's the best answer the Indian government can give. But it doesn't have the data because it's not collecting the data. And it's not collecting the data because the data is is alarming, is frightening. If they actually started to count the number of cases, they would have to do something about it. They don't want to. So it's better just to say we don't have the data, or we don't want to maintain the data. See, the emergency of 1976 came about when there was a different situation in the country. There was a lot of ferment, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the policies of the Congress government of the time. And there was a declaration of complete suspension of civil liberties. It was serious. It was extremely damaging for the democracy that we all knew and enjoyed and believed in and had faith in. But it was also lifted, and it was also an emergency that the public rejected very unequivocally. The current situation today is also a suspension of civil liberties in many ways, not just against journalists, but against many sections of society. We have students who are behind bars, we have academics behind bars, we have cases lodged against filmmakers, against writers, against ordinary citizens who file something or post something on social media. So obviously the kind of situation we are in the country today is very different from from 76. But in many ways, it's not very different, because there is a danger of democratic institutions being hollowed out from within. And while they exist, they're not doing their work, and they're not being allowed to do their work. So media houses are raided. Media houses that are complicit, that are supportive of the government, are left alone. But the ones that are independent are picked upon, they are targeted. And this is not healthy at all for a democracy.
What are your suggestions regarding this situation? How it can be improved?
Well, first of all, the institutions of democracy need to be strengthened. Justice needs to be delivered wherever people have sought the interventions of the courts. Punitive action against journalists, against people who are dissenting, must really not be allowed to continue with the freedom it has right now. Vigilante groups who file false cases or frivolous kind of cases against journalists, against other voices, must not be allowed to have free rein. The police need to, at some level, stop this. We've just had this case where a complaint was lodged against a headmistress and a parent of a school in Bidar in Karnataka. And only now the management of the school have been discharged from the sedition charge that they would, that sedition charge was quashed. But the headmistress and the parent continue to have it. And on what basis was this case lodged in the first place? Because the police didn't do their work. So, so those kind of institutions need to be strengthened. Where journalists have been killed, forget about the journalists who are right now in jail. We have about 40 journalists who were killed. And 21 of those journalists were killed for very clear reasons relating to their work as journalists. We don't have convictions. The killers have not been punished. We have one head of a religious order, this Gurmeet Ram Rahim, who's the head of the Dera Sacha Sauda, who's been on parole. And he is convicted for the murder of a journalist and the rape of one of his devotees. So impunity must stop. And the government needs to respect independent voices. instead of crushing them, they need to respect them. They don't even acknowledge the legitimacy of differences of opinion. The entire culture of penalizing dissent really has to stop.